Okay, and in the meantime, Reese posted a poll in the chat, so you guys can vote on what you're interested in. So I'm not seeing any responses. So what is this about versus on Friday? What do you mean?
I think they're probably talking about there was a like seminar that we ran Friday before the tournament.
Oh, I wasn't involved in that.
I think.
Yeah. So for clarity, the seminars on Friday, there was a content seminar on feminism, and then there was strategy seminars on front half and back half. So this seminar is specifically about debriefing motions from the tournament, going through arguments. You can also ask in general how to prep, how to think of arguments, maybe what to run if you're on back half, how to weigh arguments on both sides. So it does not require you having attended the tournament. You could just take a look at the tab link that Jacob sent and go through the motions and ask yourself if you're confused on any. He will go over it for you, and so will Reese.
Yeah, here, I'll post this again. Okay, so no one has been engaging in my question of what tech companies want. So I'm going to give perhaps some ideas. So probably since you're a major tech company, your interests are like interested in profits, which means probably like minimizing cost. And what are costs that a tech company might have? Thoughts? Cost money to like hire developers. Developers are really expensive. I know that because I worked in software engineering. Very expensive. So like making software is expensive. You probably want to, reduce like your hosting costs. That's kind of unclear. It's unclear how exactly you're going to manage to do that in this debate. But you want to minimize costs, and you want to, maximize revenues. So you want to make sure no one is stealing your business model. So you want to like maintain customers. That's an important goal. Other ways you might be able to maximize revenue. You want to make sure your app has built-in ways to make money somehow. You probably also want to make sure that your app is high quality.
Jacob, just so you know, you're no longer screen sharing.
Oh, oops. Yeah, sorry. That's kind of important.
We can't see the beautiful Vim skills.
It says that you've disabled participant screen sharing. Could you make me a host? Or
I think I'm a co-host. I think Ruth has to do that.
Ruth, please make me a host again. Tech issues, classic. In the meantime, I'm going to keep talking.
You can now screen share, Jacob.
Host.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that, guys. Okay. Move this over here. Why is my computer choosing now to be unresponsive? Come on. Okay, well, we'll get there in a second. But people talked about, for example, you want to make sure that your app is high quality, that it meets the needs of your customer base, whatever that might be, stuff like that. So those are some like potential interests. Given those interests, what are some things we could say on Gov or Op in terms of open source software? So I'll put some ideas generally for Gov or Op, and then once we get some basic ideas out, we can expand them. Mm-hmm. So based on, for people that were at the tournament, what were some arguments that you guys chose to run? And like how did it relate to these goals that we were talking about? Does anyone feel up to sharing? I could share some ideas that I heard or things that I thought about beforehand. I can't see the chat. So Reese, tell me if anyone posts in the chat. Anyone?
Yeah, I'll keep an eye there. Just if you weren't there, if you were there, thinking about routes of different ways companies can potentially generate money is sort of the key idea here. So like, what are different things? So I'll wait a little bit to see if anyone has anything they want to say. Feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat. Otherwise, we'll start sharing some things we saw in our rounds.
Okay, so I'll start with some basic ideas. So one cool thing about open source software is that other people will do work for you. So you get like free labor. There's a bit of an asterisk there, which is that you still have to manage the software. So you still need to manage software. Like when people say, I made this new code, can you add it to your app? I have to look at their code and be like, it's good, but I don't have to do all of that initial development work myself. Spend less money on developers, and notice all of those things that I'm saying. I'm trying to be comparative, like both sides obviously have labor costs, but we reduce labor costs because people will be willing to do software development for you and submit it for approval. And the other thing is you have to impact that and talk about how like development cost.
Oh, I think Jacob dropped again. So I'll pull up in the middle. So
These games based on like hundreds of thousands of hours of labor is like ridiculous. Did someone say something, Reese?
yeah. Sorry, you froze for a little bit.
Oh yeah. So then you have to ask the question of like, why do people do this free labor for you, right? There are a lot of possible reasons. So if you think about free software development work, like one really obvious example, if you're into this, is like, I don't know, you could think of the like Minecraft mod route, right? So like a lot of people, like people love the software and want to contribute, right? Minecraft mods. This also looks like, for example, Wikipedia. Like a lot of people just like the idea of working for it. It's their hobby. And that has for a lot of apps that people care about, generated tons of code. You'll find, you know, hundreds of thousands of hours of programming time and work in like websites that host Minecraft mods. People really love this stuff, and it's all completely free. So as a company, making your code open source might tap into this group of talent, and now you can benefit from their free labor. That's pretty cool. Another group that you might think about is that a lot of companies that are in the tech space do work with other tech companies as well. So for example, I worked for Expedia. Expedia is a travel company. They're a tech company. They hire lots of software engineers. And Expedia buys ad space from Google so that Google will advertise for them. And often when you have something like this, programmers from one company might want another company to implement a new feature. And if your software is closed, what they'll do is they'll just like request for it to be made. They'll do what's called like opening a ticket. They'll be like, hey, can you add this new feature? It would be really nice if you implemented it. And then they'll just like hope that that company will prioritize that into it for them. But perhaps when your company is now open source, if another company wants me to implement a feature, maybe instead of waiting for me to do it, they'll just do it for me, and then I could benefit from their free labor. So other companies will add features they need. And so this gives you two things, right? It both gives you free labor, but it also gives you responsiveness, right? Because if my code is open sourced, then a company knows if I want to add like a small tweak to the way they're doing things, I could suggest that tweak and it'll get implemented. Whereas if my code is closed source, it's a lot harder for people to suggest those types of changes and see them implemented. So the fact that you're now able to get like much faster, more responsive updates means we not only hit this thing of reducing costs, but we also get stuff like this where we're making sure our app is high quality and built in a way that is going to be like good for other businesses to be able to access. So that's like one reason why it's nice to have free labor. One reason why open source software is good for companies, I mean. So that's one argument. Does anyone else, now that I've explained one, feel brave enough to share some of their ideas? Anyone? I mean, feasibly, people had cases from this weekend, no?
Nobody's willing to share. I can jump in and see A, what some of my thoughts are, and B, what some things I saw were. But I'm gonna open the floor for other people. So I think the other thing is there's one about mitigating costs, but the second, I got some private messages. Someone asking, isn't the company giving the open source code going to have costs? So yeah, I mean, there are potential costs, and those costs can probably manifest in two ways. One, Jacob added is the asterisk, which is like you probably still have to manage the software, but in that case, there's a weighing act where like the management of your software is probably less than the initial cost that you like have spent, like you get from free labor. So that's one weighing thing. You can probably outweigh that. The second way that probably happens is you're probably thinking, well, aren't people going to be copycats or trying to steal your code, and you lose potential shares of the market, right? And so I think this is where we're going to get into the argument I saw, which is the idea of how at the point at which it is easier for companies to integrate your existing software, how that allows you to get greater control of the market, right? So there's two ways this sort of operates. One is that you get free labor, as Jacob was pointing out, where people develop your product or give you better integration with other softwares, which make you more successful, right? So the example with Expedia is, instead of Expedia having to like build their own service and have to, if this feature isn't offered by Google, build their own service, build their own platform, and build everything off of that. They just integrate Google, add functionality or features to Google, and then can build off of that. A similar thing would be like an Android OS, where like if in certain markets they have different requirements, like a double SD card in like Asian markets, it allows them easier access if someone's just adding their software for them to be able to sell a modified version of their product with a modified OS that someone else had built in order to access these markets. And so the weighing probably is maybe there's a potential risk of people like making copycat code, but the more likely outcome is that people are integrating your software, building off of it with their services, which ultimately like funnels like action and transaction and business through your service at all. And so it's sort of this idea of integration as opposed to competition.
Yeah, there are also a number of other things. So for example, there are legal mechanisms to stop competition. So like licensing. So even though your software is open source, usually there's still like a license associated with it. So you're like, you can look at the software, you can modify it, you can run it on your own computer, but you're not allowed to like use it for your own profit, right? That's a very common model that people will make. And so you could go after people like in court if they actually try to do that, right? Now, it is true that it's very difficult to go after like random people on the internet. I could be hiding my website in some random server in Russia, and maybe they're outside of my jurisdiction. But to the extent that they're so limited, and as soon as they grow to the size where I can sue them, they'll be sued out of existence. It's difficult to get away with copying to the point where you're a legitimate competitor to this massive business. So like maybe so that's kind of an issue. The other thing you could say is there's also some like comparative stuff, which is that if you're worried about people stealing your code, the fact is people kind of steal code right now, even when it's not open source. So I don't know how many of you guys use Instagram stories, but it's like pretty obviously blatantly ripped off from Snapchat. And one of the things I do outside of debate is computer science tutoring. So I can promise you that pretty much any of you guys, if you wanted to, would be able to learn how to like make your own version of Instagram in like, you know, a few months if you like practiced at it. And so often like the types of software that's stolen is like not particularly difficult if you have a team of developers to make. And so like the degree to which you stop copycats isn't actually that significant when copying code kind of already happens, or at least copying the functions that are implemented by the code happens. People already rip off features, e.g. snap stories on Instagram. Like that's one example. There are many examples of companies like that blatantly ripping each other off. There's also some network effect stuff, right? That's just like economics, right? Like if I clone Instagram, I have 0 users. And which social media do you want to join? Instagram that has like hundreds of millions of people on it, or my brand new identical copy of Instagram that has no one using it right now, right? So given that we framed the debate that you're already a massive tech company, you can then benefit from this network effect and prevent competition, even if they copy your code identically, and even if the legal mechanisms preventing them from getting away with ripping you off can't be enforced. So that's one thing. In addition to just users, like data is also relevant. So like, for example, I don't know how many of you guys use Bing. It sucks, but there's nothing wrong with the developers at Microsoft, right? Feasibly, they're very smart people. The reason why Bing can't be as good as Google is in part because they just don't have the data to process, right? So it would be possible for Bing to have the exact same algorithms that Google has to like go through data and come up with good search results. But if they don't have that data in the first place, those algorithms aren't going to be much use. Likewise, the fact that you're a big firm also means you can do some somewhat slimy tactics. So for example, I don't know how many of you know this, but Google pays Apple guess how much Google pays Apple to be the default search engine on Apple devices? Anyone know? Anyone want to make an estimate? Reese, do you have a guess? Do you know?
I would
Should tell you?
imagine someone says billion.
Yeah, so $1 billion. That's a good guess. The actual answer is $10 billion, which is just an obscene quantity of money. So Google has so much money they can just pay Apple $10 billion. So I have a question. Like if you tomorrow come up with Google and you have all of Google's data, it's the same, right? Are you going to be able to pay Apple $10 billion to get on all of the iPhones? No, right? So given that we frame this debate as you're a big tech company, the idea of people directly stealing your software is not only legally infeasible, economically infeasible, socially infeasible, all of those other things. And also, even if somehow they manage to overcome all of those barriers, it's not particularly comparative because we already told you that developers are somewhat able to do this. See like the example that we gave about Snapchat. So that's one way that you think this is like sort of what I expect when we're like giving all of our code to the public. Some potential issues that we'd encounter. And so that's sort of how you could like outframe the other team. So those are like some big things. There are other things, right? You might say like trust. Trust is a big one. And this is something we'll be turning when we go to the opposition case. So a lot of people like care about things like privacy. They care that they're not being spied on. They care that you know, the Zuck isn't collecting all of their data and using it to spy on them. You know, want to know Zuck isn't spying on you. And maybe this isn't true for social media, but for a lot of business-to-business services where like what is being dealt with is like very secure, sensitive in some way, or where you're trying to target something towards a market that cares about security. So like people that make VPNs or like encrypted texting chats, people sort of want to know that the service they're using is safe and like legitimate. So you can increase trust in your brand by like being completely open with what your software does. And that potentially is a benefit, right? That's the thing we said about, you know, making sure your app is high quality, making sure users want to use your app, increase the number of people using it, increase your profits, right? So everything should be tied back to the impacts on the like actor that we're characterizing. So those are some ideas of govs. Does anyone have anything that was not mentioned in terms of gov arguments for that motion before we go into op arguments? No? Okay, but if anyone has questions on any of these things, feel free to post them in chat at any point. Let's talk op arguments. So why wouldn't you want to expose all of your code to the public? Maybe we could start with this one and see if this one could get turned, perhaps. Do you think the Zuck wants everyone to know what Facebook is doing behind their back?
Also, guys, if you want to like say something but not like stay anonymous, you can also just like private message it to me and I'll read it out loud without like me saying your name. So people won't have to know you said it if you want to share, but you don't want to be like, you want to remain anonymous.
So like lots of companies, for example, make bank by exploiting user data, cough, TikTok, like where you'll have like stuff that is like ridiculously insecure and vulnerable and might be a turnoff, but is massively profitable for your company. Like Facebook loves spying on you. Google makes a ton of money off of collecting your data. Like it's massively profitable. And they don't necessarily want you to know that they're doing it, right? Like, because if they can get away with doing this on the DL, then they will, right? So the idea that you might perhaps open yourself up to public scrutiny as a company that is not super concerned about public welfare is potentially dangerous, right? So like that is one way you can frame it. And especially when you talk about the degree, how important is this to your company, right? Like if a huge portion of your business model is based on things that are a little exploitative of users, then perhaps this isn't something we want people to know about. What else might we say on opposition?
Someone asked if you can see all of this, the use of data through the code. And the answer is probably.
I'm
like if you're yeah, sorry, Jacob.
Yeah. So Reese, you could actually answer that question.
Yeah, it's sort of like at the point at which your code is open source, like specific dealings of business and who they're selling data to and all of that details is likely still anonymous. But you're still probably going to face some degree of like media backlash where someone combed through your code and saw that it was building caches of private user data and building user profiles like over a period of time. And so even if you're still like people don't know who you're selling it to, the possibility that you are building those user caches and that's publicly available information is probably, regardless if you're doing something ethical or not, going to have a degree of public scrutiny over how your business is organized. So it's actually worse that we don't know who you're selling it to or we don't know that back information, because the very fact that you're collecting this information probably raises immense scrutiny and criticism. So like, that actually helps impact this argument further, probably. We also got a question about like, is there going to be a recording of this class, just unrelated to this? Yeah. Yes, I'm pretty sure it's going to be uploaded to YouTube, so you should be able to access it there.
Yeah. So one other thing on privacy is it's not just about the perspective of the public, but also it's about exploitation. So a lot of companies put a lot of effort into making sure they're never broadcasting the inner workings of their code. And the reason is because if you're a hacker, trying to like access our services, it is incredibly useful to be able to see exactly how a company's application is working. So you can find exactly where you need to like, inject malicious code in order to get the effect you desire. And so when you completely open up your code and everyone can see line by line exactly what your servers are doing, it becomes a lot easier to tailor attacks towards you. Actually, I'm gonna have a general thing about like hacking and malicious stuff. So not only do you make it way easier for hacks and exploits, you also make things like, I don't know, like phishing attacks really easy. I can, for example, like completely like, I don't know, like clone Facebook. I can have show you a carbon copy of Facebook complete with all of their like images and stuff, and send it to you, except when you type in your username and password, like it just sends it to me and then I'll go to real Facebook and log in, right? Obviously right now, people can still do this and they do, but when your code is like literally open source, I can just copy and paste it. It becomes way easier than me having to try to do this by hand. And so for low skilled, scammers, becomes way easier. So this is something that I thought was kind of clever that some kids ran in my room, that like, it not only is this bad for users, but it also devalues your brand image when like people can't necessarily trust you as much. So what else might we say on opposition? One thing, for example, is like Gov really says that like you'll see this is like a lot of mitigation, like we're like mitigating a lot of stuff, and really the crux of this case is about this free labor that you're getting. So you might mitigate the free labor. You might be like, actually, open source labor not so good. So for example, it's like highly decentralized and disjoint. So like open source development, it's very difficult to have some sort of central plan for how you want to develop your software, what direction you want to go in. You're sort of just relying on the public to add what they want. And it's difficult for you to have some central vision about exactly what your development goals are. And then in order to, if you want to compensate for that problem and make sure people that suggest changes are not putting in like garbage that is going to make you like decrease the like unity of your software, it requires like increased labor on your end for integration. Because when you think about like successful companies, like, I don't know, like Google, for example, they have like a lot of integration across all of their services. They have like central planning about how the services cooperate with each other to like get a better user experience. And so if you have people just adding randomly with no central planning or authority, because it's just random businesses adding features as they want, for you to like make like either stop that from happening and making your services be like completely disjoint, or you're going to have tons of time like combing through everyone's submissions and making sure that it's not going to cause those types of problems, which might even just be cheaper if you did it yourself. So for example, CZ Liu, the person who made TabbyCat, which is open source, rejects tons of requests for changes because it's like not within the goal of the project, which is kind of an L. But with huge numbers of people sending you ideas, many of which are trash, like huge influx of ideas, 90% of which are garbage, likely more work for you. I mean, think about how many like rookie programmers are going to be sending people their like ideas for what iOS should start doing because they have some great idea for a feature that like Tim Apple wants nothing to do with. And so the notion that this free labor is not just like actually more work for you rather than less is a little dubious. So for example, like English teachers have, you know, tons of free labor in terms of children writing essays for them. But if those essays are garbage and they have to spend a huge amount of time grading them, it's not like their like publishing company is going to profit as a result. That analogy was very tired, but perhaps you get this idea. And so if a huge portion of the government case is this idea of free labor, attacking that underlying assumption is a very useful thing for you to do on side opposition.
Also, like additionally on that point, there's probably a degree, like a higher degree of accountability in terms of code review when you're actually submitting these, right? Because at the point at which you're maintaining open source software, the degree to which the risk of accepting non-vetted programmers from submitting code is also very high. So you want to prevent people from adding backdoors, adding malicious code, anything like that. So you have to be very, very stringent in terms of your vetting. So the conception that you get from Gov that this is like pretty easy, you just say, oh, this is good code, we'll run it. Like you have to do, there's probably higher degrees of scrutiny when submitting this code, like when reviewing this code than you even would for an internal
yeah,
team.
so that's the thing we were talking about exploitation. But this is even like a level above that, which is that like when Reese says a backdoor, does any of you guys know what that is? Like a backdoor in software? It's where I add code that is going to enable me to get access to the service. That in some cases it's like very obvious in the case of like where you're directly hacking, but in this case, I might add something that is like has a small bug in it that is very difficult to notice, but that is like tailored such that I'll be able to get access to the code base. And spotting stuff like that is very difficult. And so if there are people who have strong financial incentives to add these backdoors into Google, and now you have to comb through all of them to make sure these minor things that you never have to worry about when it's your own loyal employees writing the code, it actually could be tremendously either dangerous or expensive to stop these types of exploits from happening. And obviously, if they do happen, it could ruin your business, completely destroy your credibility or any other number of things like that. So honestly,
oh, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say we're about half an hour in, and so if we wanted to move on to the next motion.
I was about to say we're going to move on. Yeah, I think we have like enough things. Unless there are like really like urgent questions about this, I do want to move on to other motions. But hopefully you have some idea of like a reasonable case that you could feel confident about on both sides.
While we're moving on, people have more questions about like where they're going to find the link to the recording of the seminar. So where is that going to be posted, just so people know?
We're gonna upload the seminars onto YouTube hopefully, and then we'll email it out to you hopefully within the coming week.
Yeah. Okay. Reese, did people answer your poll and or suggest other motions?
Yeah, so the top two motions at the moment are round 5, the bread tube motion, or quarterfinals, the Source prefers a world in which artists don't pursue
Reese, what do you want to talk about? I think the in-round I'm more leaning towards just because it's an in-round and not an out-round. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
What is the exact wording of the motion? I could pull it up, but
that has an info slide. I'll find you the exact wording. I'll put it in the chat just so also people can see it. The info slide as well as the motion should be there in the chat now.
I can see the chat. So it's like this has
Red tube prioritization of trying to de-radicalize the alt-right.
Okay, in a feeble attempt to see if we can get more user participation, does anyone have some ideas for framing or gov or op arguments before we start giving our own takes? It's a good time to get feedback.
Is again, the policy of privately messaging me also stands in case you want to remain anonymized. Okay, people like a minute-ish.
I'm going to start writing some questions, and you can think about what the answers to these questions might be. And I said this in a previous seminar about modeling and framing that I gave to the MDU, but debate as an activity heavily favors answering the right questions more than it favors answering the right questions extremely well. So if you, for example, give me an impact to an argument, even if that impact is a little silly or a little bit difficult to believe or doesn't use proper nouns or whatever, like I'm gonna, as a judge, credit that you gave me an impact that I can weigh much, like orders of magnitude more than a team that didn't give an impact. So even if, like what does de-radicalizing the alt-right entail? Maybe you don't know, right? Maybe you're not like, like on these parts of YouTube, which is totally valid. And you don't really know what that entails. Come up with a reasonable guess that you think is like a reasonable conception of the round and give that answer. Because even if the answer isn't perfect, compared to teams that don't do these things, aren't characterizing, aren't framing, you're going to end up doing really well. And I think that the fear that a lot of teams have about answering questions they don't fully know the answer to often stops them from building a complete case that is able to be as round-winning as the others would like. So I'm going to ask you to think about these things.
I have
come up with
one response so far, which is instead of a clear debate, you have a fight, which I think means that like the type of discussion you have changes to being like more hostile or more confrontational as opposed to more discourse oriented, I imagine is what that's trying to say.
On which side?
I imagine the regret side. So I imagine it'll be a gov stance.
Yeah, I think this is interesting because I actually think this can go either way.
Yeah, I agree.
So one thing you could say is, look, when you're trying to de-radicalize people, you have to be Ben Shapiro, absolutely destroying the alt-right with facts and logic. And that's one way you could approach it. Another way is to try to be understanding of people, to empathize with them, but explain where they went wrong. And if your goal is to de-radicalize, right, feasibly you want to be approachable, you want to be someone that people will at least have a degree of respect and to listen to in the first place. There's a reason why most like leftists aren't going to be particularly compelled by Ben Shapiro absolutely destroying them with facts and logic, which is that, hostility generally turns people away. So both of these characterizations could happen. And so then it's your job to think, well, given the goals that you have of like moving these people away from the alt-right, which strategy is more likely given those goals? You have a clash on both sides, but whether or not the discourse about the alt-right becomes more hostile or less hostile and on which side. And that's not like an argument for one side or another. It's a clash in the debate that might, either side has an obligation to partake in.
I have another interesting comment for framing, which is about the answering the question about de-radicalizing entail, and basically the framing that the Gov team gives that given political polarization and due to the nature of the alt-right, there's lots of reasons why de-radicalization is either going to be really challenging or probably going to be ineffective, right?
Yeah.
So the types of discourse that you actually have to engage in, the fact that they're probably pretty polarized and entrenched in their ideas anyway, the fact that they demonize leftists and have done that since day one. There's lots of structural reasons why it's going to be difficult to shift point of view.
Yeah, so that's a really good piece of framing. Talking about like the echo chambers people live in, talking about the like types of almost brainwashing that people have fallen into. And once again, this is something that is the difference between modeling and framing is that framing is really contentious, right? So one way of saying it is people are coming from these echo chambers. They're super like they're only fed this one piece of information for years sometimes, and it becomes their entire worldview that they're attached to, often violently. Like the type of indoctrination you need for people to like shoot up a church or drive through a bunch of protesters has to be immense, and it's unlikely that some YouTube videos are going to change that person's mind, right? So that might be a gov stance that says this is not worth our time, we should do something else. It also might be a stance that says, you know what, that's why we have to try super hard because it's difficult and no one else is going to do it, so we need to try. But perhaps another avenue of viewing that is actually the alt-right is not these like complete monsters. They're people that fell down a rabbit hole of watching certain videos that were off to a bad start, that maybe got like rejected and feel sad about how they look and wander down a path ending up in being an incel, but they're still savable, right? That they still have like decent, like still have human decency and some shared values, even if those shared values have been like cleaved by the underlying indoctrination that they've dealt with. And so even though it's probably true that these arguments that you're describing about how difficult this is are true, I don't want to, that can also be turned on the other side by questioning how true that is. And then that's another clash that happens in the debate. And because it's debate, it's debatable.
Because I think
it's really good.
Other counter framing that an op team is likely to give is that what radicalization looks like in the alt-right isn't like you're not alt-right one day and you're alt-right the other day, but that there's degrees of radicalization, and that providing a countervailing force to try and reach out to the people who are like in the outermost layers of this radicalization is a good way to stop people from going further down the pipeline and sort of pull them out. And so you can even concede to the gov framing that like maybe some people are far gone, but even so, we want to stop more people from falling down that point of no return.
Yeah. And it's interesting though. I think the reason why framing is so important is because usually like framing of around is where like all of your arguments come from, right? So like we're just talking about like, you know, is it difficult to de-radicalize these people? And just that question, which seems neutral in terms of what side of the debate it would fall on, gives you all sorts of arguments about like how we're able to reach out to people in a unique way, and a lot of like really interesting nuanced analysis that both gov and op can benefit from. Other thoughts from the audience, Reese? Or
nothing yet. I also think an important question you probably want to answer in this debate, just to spur off other people, is like, what is unique about BreadTube and what can it achieve that maybe other forms of political discussion can't, other forms of political discourse? What is unique about BreadTube? My hint would be like, what sort of platforms does it exist on? Like, is like compared to other conventional left-wing media and discussion, like how does it present itself? All of these sort of questions. Yeah, and I'm getting some pretty good responses here. So BreadTube targets a younger age group, which is true. It sort of is on that like young YouTube, like entertaining platform where like conservatives tend to thrive under status quo, which is like the YouTube youth demographic.
Yeah.
And recognize that this framing probably can be used in argumentation for both sides, right? You can see how this can make arguments for both sides.
Yeah. So like if your framing is, this is why it's, you know, important. Let's say you're an op. You might say something like, you have a, you know, like often, you know, radicalization is a slow process. Importantly, you exist on the same platform where it's taking place. So like a lot of this radicalization happens on YouTube as people, you know, are watching their like, you know,
Epic Feminist
like,
Wrecked Part 7.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like often like you have an audience there that are becoming corrupted and you have an opportunity to like jump in. So you might say like here and is a slow process and you're primed to intervene. So it's like, you know, if you're standing right next to someone that's drowning in a pool, even if you have something good to do, being able to like, you know, run in and grab them out is nice. You might also, just as framing of like, why is, obviously both sides care about de-radicalizing people, but it's important to probably impact why that's important. You know, you might just feel like, you know, de-radicalizing equals, you know, you might say less violence, less, you know, fascist governments, right, etc. Right? You have less, you know, rallies of people that are shouting racist things, which reduces like victimization. You know, this is a whole ordeal of like why it's an important goal. You know, Gov might say why it's not an important goal, which is like, look, even if you shift them a bit, if you're like deep in the alt-right, you're like never going to be like fully progressive, like at best, they can hope you become someone that's just like, you know, a moderate Republican that won't scream racial slurs at people on 4chan, but is still not going to ever be an advocate for progressive change. And so if you're looking at who you are going to spend your time on, maybe these are like less important actors than say someone that you might be able to turn into an advocate, someone that you can convince to, you know, become a political activist, form unions, etc. And so maybe you say like, yes, it's a good goal to de-radicalize people, but compared to focusing on people that are already towards the left and making sure they have the marginal education and radicalization necessary to actually like do things that are good for like the leftist agenda, whatever that may be, you might argue that that's more important. So, you know, we're going to recruit people to do door knocking for Bernie Sanders or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah. I think that
whereas-
shifts.
yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jacob.
No.
No, I was going to say, I think this shifts to another important question, was whenever you're talking, because we ran a lot of regrets motions at this tournament, and I think whenever you're talking about a regrets motion, I think in a motion like this, you want to be saying, what's the alternative, right? Counterfactual is the fancy debate term for alternative. So you want to establish, like, why is there a trade-off? Like, what can't you do when you de-radicalize the alt-right that you can do when you no longer radicalize? So the arguments I ran into in my room were a lot of like, well, you have to shift more right in order to even attract a right-wing audience, right?
Mhm.
So it limits the degree of leftist discourse you can have.
Yeah, that's interesting. And also, like, you know, algorithms will group people. So, like, if there are a lot of, you know, right-wing type people watching your videos, it's unlikely that you're going to be suggested to, like, ultra left-leaning people that you otherwise might want to appeal to. Yeah.
I have a good argument. They say on op, but I think this is probably meant like a gov argument, which is that when you engage with the alt-right, you legitimize those ideas, right?
Yeah.
So, like, giving them a platform, make sure that those makes it seem like those discussions are up for debate as opposed to settled issues. So this is like the classic anti-free speech argument or limitations on free speech argument, which is like, if you debate climate change or you debate like the humanity of trans people, you make it seem like those ideas are up for debate as opposed to settled issues where there's just one factually correct side and one incorrect side, right?
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, and you also might want to frame why that happens. That you like sort of need to explain their arguments charitably or reference people within the alt-right in order to then debunk them. And there's a question of whether or not it's like particularly useful to do that. And then, you know, you could bring in the analysis from this House regrets political debates argument. Whatever. Maybe there's a little bit of similarities. Other thoughts from people? People want more concrete things. So you might say on Gov, like, yeah, you probably want to like emphasize the trade-off, you know, like focus on like activating people already on the left for action, e.g. door knocking. That's not how knocking is spelled. We're good. The leftist political candidates, etc. This is something that, like, you know, alt-right will never do, even if you make them into a more moderate person.
Yeah. And I think this leads into sort of like an interesting point, which is like people often are unsure in discussions about like political discourse, like how you actually impact that. They'll be like, oh, you get less radicals or you get more leftist. And then it's like you often stop there and you don't treat that as an impact. And usually that's pretty hard to weigh. So what Jacob's doing now, which is like, hey, there's a trade-off between getting people to actually take political action, like door knocking, campaigning, voting, all of that, versus like not that. That makes it really easy to actually impact and weigh these arguments in a debate. Because this is a lot. This can be like, well, now we get more left-wing governments and that has tangible impacts versus like having less right-wingers. Like as an impact is harder to impact if you like harder to weigh if you don't take that additional impact.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I have a tangential thing that isn't about this motion in particular, but it's something that I observed in multiple rounds of the tournament. People would often use like increased political polarization as an impact to their argument. And the thing is, I just don't intrinsically know why that's a bad thing. And maybe it is, but like you need to explain to me why polarization is bad, why more people on your side is good, you know? If someone's behind their computer and they're like, yeah, I agree with you, like that's, I guess it makes me feel nice on the inside, but is that really an impact, right? So explain how that agrees into things that I really concretely care about, or why polarization concretely is bad. You know, for polarization, you might talk about like political gridlock, when people are never willing to compromise and the government becomes inefficient and inactive and can't provide basic services. And you have like government shutdowns that like ruin their ability to, you know, it's bad for hundreds of thousands of people employed by the government, and you know all the services the government provides to people. And you could talk about how, you know, increased radicalism on both sides leads to more like partisan violence and increase in like, you know, alt-right brutality against people, stuff like that, right? So people care about violence, people care about their government functioning in a basic way. People do not care about polarization, they care about the results of polarization. So always make sure you're like making sure the impacts are things that, regardless of your level of understanding about the world, you care about that thing. Like even like a total, you know, baby knows that like, you know, political violence is bad. But
like impacts need to be things that are harms in themselves and not just like a thing that starts harm, right? So like, I don't know, the really basic example, I'm trying to get into a weird philosophy state of mind, but it's like the harm isn't that someone pulled the trigger, the harm is that like a person was shot, right? And so don't start at the point of like the cause of the harm, but take it to the point of like the actual harm.
Yeah, that is good. Do people want to continue talking about this or go into another motion? Because we've given maybe like a few concrete arguments for both sides, and I think a lot of framing that would enable you to construct a reasonably solid case. But if people want to spend more time on this, I'm totally fine with it. Otherwise, we can move on to the arts motion.
Yeah, we have like a few minutes, so if people have any questions, feel free, or else we're going to give like a very cursory look at the arts motion.
Yeah, it's like something like this house.
This house prefers a world in which artists don't pursue mainstream success. Okay, people are saying we can move on. And by people, I mean one person. But
that's great. I love that one person. I don't even know who it is. Don't pursue.
Here's the info slide for people who are curious. I'll post it in the chat. For the sake of okay.
And once again, the way I'm writing my notes, like framing good luck, is a very good way to write your notes when you're prepping any round, not just giving a seminar. So, and also the style of like thinking of questions and answering the questions and then coming up with arguments from those answers is a very good way to make cases. It's an extremely good way to make extensions by answering questions people didn't answer. And I would encourage you to use that as a strategy and ask your partners questions during prep and stuff like that. Framing stuff. Is mainstream art good? Like, what does pursuing mainstream look like? How do artists change behavior?
What does being in the mainstream help an artist achieve?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm going to say, what does it do to an artist in general? Maybe it helps them achieve more. Maybe it hurts them. Maybe it makes them feel tied down to their audience in a way that's harmful. Unclear. Anyone have answers to these questions?
Or arguments in general? Any thoughts on the motion? Any comments?
How is this world different macroscopically? So, e.g., when all artists are engaging in this. This last one is something that a lot of teams neglected and is relatively important.
Because it's, when you're talking about this house prefers a world motion, you can't just talk about impacts on individual artists, but you can often get a lot by saying, on net, if all artists don't do this, how would the world and structures relating to artists, not just artists themselves, behave and act? I have a comment here. So yeah, so what pursuing mainstream success doesn't always coincide for what it means to be for an artist to be like themselves. So like you're often tied down, or you have to make sacrifices, or you have to appeal to demographics that maybe aren't within line with like your artistic vision.
Yeah. And I think this is something that a lot of teams neglected some nuance in, which is that I think people like art that feels genuine, right? Like you want to listen to a song and think that that song is like about the actual artist. There's a lot of art that has like an emphasis on reality, where like you want to, I don't know, feel that there's something human about it. And so in that sense, it feels like it would reward self-expression, even if your own self is different from other people. But the reality is that a lot of that quote unquote self-expression is just about having the optics of self-expression without actually necessarily doing it. So, you know, like if you watch like a comedian, a lot of the stories you're telling are like totally fake, or like a lot of songs are about subject material that has nothing to do with the artist, that just has the like veneer of self-expression. And so there's some nuance about how you balance that self-expression with ideals society places on you in order to get that degree of success. So it's not that you like can never self-express, just you're restricted to some extent, and that informs the way you change.
We have a couple of comments. One person I think gives a potential mechanism for one of the framings or potential argument, which is like when you pursue mainstream success, you have an incentive to appeal to what people already want, like you appeal to existing demographics, which I think interesting. And I think that's an important impact. The second thing, and I think we should probably spend the last few minutes doing this, is someone was curious about what like ideas for how you would go about coming up with an extension for this debate. So if it seems like I think what I would say is identify what you think the probably obvious arguments, framing, and impact that's going to come is, and then try and look at a different scope, right? And so I think Jacob's highlighted that's where this point about different macroscopic impacts and structural things really come into play. But if
Yeah, so one thing you can think of, for example, this might not have been extension material in your round, but like I said, the general rule for how you come up with an extension is by asking lots of questions in prep during the round, formulating some answers, and then asking yourself what questions were left unanswered. So I'll give you an example based on the round I watched. You might have watched a different round and the questions that were left unanswered were different, but the strategy applies nonetheless. So in my round, there was an assumption that the pursuit of mainstream success enables you to get there, right? So one criticism that would be great for example, a Gov extension would be to say, actually, an artist is actually no more likely to achieve mainstream success on either side of the house, because art is zero sum, right? Like people consume a certain amount of music, a certain amount of movies, a certain amount of art, whatever. And if every artist is trying to pursue mainstream success, or a huge number are, even if not everyone is on the counterfactual, then each individual artist is no more likely than if everyone tries less, right? Because, you know, no one is sort of aiming for that end like niche. So when everyone competes less, it doesn't change the likelihood that any individual is likely to do well. Does that make sense? That reasoning? And then from that, you could say, therefore, if, for example, opening like opposition has lots of argumentation about how like success is necessary for you to like, you know, maintain your art and reach a large audience, all of those things you might say, you're equally likely to do that on our side because of the fact that other artists aren't like vehemently competing with you and making sure that like they're tailoring to exactly what audiences want. And that it's the competition with those artists that are trying to pursue mainstream success that makes it difficult for you to self-actualize.
Yeah,
that's like a spicy extension.
So I saw also an interesting extension, which was building off of sort of the macroscopic stuff. I'm going to tie in the comments that people are making to me, which is this idea of like the probably likely Gov case that people are going to run, which I sort of saw was run when you want to pursue mainstream success. Maybe people pursue art more out of passion, or when you pursue mainstream success, you become less authentic because you're tied down by contracts or industry expectations, or just generally trying to appeal to the audience. And what happened with the extension of my round after OG sort of ran that government case is they looked macroscopic and they said, hey, under status quo, this desire for people to pursue mainstream success gives a lot of leverage to institutions like Hollywood recruiters or like K-pop band recruiters under status quo, who have a lot of leverage because everyone wants to pursue mainstream success. And that means that these companies, these industries, these labels, these sort of like agents hold a lot of leverage over these people who really are only in the game to pursue success, right? And they get there's a lot of harm from that. There's a lot of exploitation. And so in a world where no one really cared that much about success and no one actively pursued it, the entire system would restructure itself, and there would no longer be a place for these industries, because if you didn't get success, like and your agent was treating you poorly, you just leave your agent because you're not there for success, you're there for the art, right? And so the system itself, not just the artist, but the system that exists around art and the industry would change and restructure. And that's sort of an example of looking at the macroscopic and not at the artists themselves, but how the system changes as a whole.
Yeah. So the other thing is just like the idea of like world building and really trying to imagine all of the ripples of how like changing some aspect of the world will affect other things. It's not obvious on face value how artists changing their prioritization like affects Hollywood recruiters and agents, right? But when you're able to sort of fully imagine this world and paint a picture in a judge's mind, it becomes very easy to access all of these like very interesting extensions that other teams are less likely to think about. So always make sure you're like doing that world building and asking those important questions. And I think that's one of the best ways to come up with good extensions. And the best thing is that if you're on back half, you have lots of time to do it. In this format, you'd have an extra 20 minutes to think of like all of those little details that the top half team doesn't. And so it's like quite an advantage that you can use. Is that responsive to the people that were interested in extension stuff?
I hope so.
Nice. So it looks like we're a little bit over time. So I think we're going to be wrapping up. But if anyone has any like last minute questions, we'd be like perfectly happy to answer them. Like brief things, maybe for the next like few minutes, just in case there were like things that we said that are like still confusing to people.
Mm-hmm.
Do people like the motions of the tournament?
I got an answer, yes.
Lit, I'm so happy. Okay, good stuff. All right, I guess we can stop the recording at this point.
Yeah. Okay,
I'll
thank
stop
you
the
both
recording.